Theodor Herzl, you may know him as the founder of Zionism. And I'll kind of come in and out of the screens because I like to see everybody. But Theodor Herzl, before he was the founder of Zionism, was a writer and a reporter. And in his career as a reporter, he would go around Europe, and during the time he was living, there was quite a bit going on. And what you may not know about Herzl is that before he was the founder of Zionism, he used to write op-eds about Judaism. And it's not the type of op-eds you would think. One particular op-ed implored Jewish people to baptize their children, saying that what right do we have as parents, what right do we have to make our children suffer the way our ancestors have? It'd be better if they were baptized as Christians and let them live free in a society. And he had a Christmas tree in his house. He didn't light his first Hanukkah menorah until he was in his 20s. This doesn't sound like the makings of the founder of Zionism. But in his role as a reporter, he was assigned to cover the Dreyfus Affair. And the Dreyfus Affair, if you're not familiar, was an issue with a French military officer, high-ranking, who was Jewish. And he was accused of being a spy and a traitor. And his trial was very widespread and well known. And Herzl was sent from Vienna to cover it for the newspaper. And when he got there, and when the masses were gathered outside of the courtroom, what he witnessed changed his whole worldview. People in the crowd were not shouting death to traitors. They weren't shouting death to Dreyfus even. They were shouting death to Jews. And from that moment on, Theodor Herzl realized that Jews, as comfortable as they were in Austria, in Germany, in France, would always be the other, would always be the scapegoat, would always be the target for like the pogroms in Russia. When things weren't going well, they were taking it out on the Jews. And Herzl had this realization that the only place Jews could be free and comfortable would be not only in the land of Israel, but in a Jewish state in the land of Israel. And that's an important distinction, because there have been Jews in the land of Israel continuously for well over 3,000 years. But there's only been a state of Israel 3 times. When Abraham was in the land of Israel, and that's biblical, not archaeological, it wasn't the state of Israel. It was the land of the Canaanites and the Jebusites. And when Moses got there when Moses almost got there and Joshua took the people in, Joshua had to battle for the land. And when they established the first kingdom, the second kingdom, which then split, after really the split of the second kingdom, the land of Israel was mostly run by outside forces. You had the Macedonian Empire, where the Greeks had control of Israel, the Romans had control of Israel, the Seleucid Empire had control of Israel, then the Caliphate, then the Byzantines, then the Ottomans. So Israel was always a place where Jews lived under the control of a larger empire since that second kingdom collapsed. So Herzl had this goal of not only getting Jews to Israel, but founding a Jewish state. So I'm going to go back to my screen share.
Yeah, thank you.
And in 1881, what you have here is what's known as the first Aliyah. And the first Aliyah Aliyah, the same word used for calling up to the Torah. When you move to Israel, you're considered an olim, which literally means somebody who has ascended, somebody who has gone up. So after the pogroms in Russia, we're talking Fiddler on the Roof time here. After the pogroms in Russia, 35,000 Jews came to Israel. They were funded by both American and British money, and they were largely farmers, and they established moshavs. A moshav is a settlement that is really centered on agriculture. Now, it's important to note, and when you say funded, it wasn't just the travel that was funded. It was the purchase of the land that was funded. So Israel is a both desert and mountainous region with a lot of open space. So they were buying land. They're moving to the land of Israel in pretty large numbers. About 20 years later, after the Tsarist pogroms continued, there was a second wave of Jews who came to Israel. And they were younger. And they were not only agricultural, they were socialists, which led to the establishment of kibbutzim, a kibbutz. Kibbutz is very similar to moshav. It's a shared community, but in this case, everything is shared. A kibbutz is usually has a central industry. Back then, it was mostly farming. But not only did they establish a kibbutz, they revived Hebrew as a spoken language and established Tel Aviv. Before we get to the third aliyah. Okay, I see a chat. Okay, so the when it says they reestablished Hebrew as a spoken language, one thing that you may not know is that we're not sure historically if Hebrew was ever a spoken language in Judaism. We know it was always our language of prayer and our language of study, but there's really no hard evidence that Hebrew was ever a conversational and spoken language. But that started with the second Aliyah, and also kind of mimicked what was going on in Germany, which was the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And Jews were starting to, they kind of proclaimed themselves the new Jew. The old Jew in their minds were in the shtetls and they were studying and they were praying. The new Jew was out working the land, plowing the fields, creating something, and they saw themselves as the true ancestors to the Jews of old, the Jews of the Bible, when the Torah was largely about an agricultural people. So I mentioned they established Tel Aviv. I want to share a picture. Give me 1 second. Share screen, go. This is a picture of Tel Aviv. This is the formal founding of the city of Tel Aviv, and it looks like a nice metropolis. It is completely empty. It is a desert. It is barren. They're not far from the Mediterranean. You can imagine, I don't know what time of year they were there exactly, but wearing the clothes they're wearing, it had to have been hot there. But that's Tel Aviv. It is, when I mentioned that they were buying land to establish the state of Israel, they were buying it either from the empire or from people who owned it, or they were just paying a nominal fee to take over vacant land. That's going to become important shortly. The third wave sees an expansion, not just Russia, but Hungary and Poland. And this Aliyah starts around the time of World War I. And it's when when these cities start to establish their infrastructure. And it's also when they start to form not just an army, but a clandestine defense organization. Things like the Mossad and the IDF can trace their roots back to this moment. And of course, we know what's going on in the rest of the world as the issues in Europe, which are going to lead to the rise of Hitler, as well as you have this issue that Jews are starting to feel the sense that they're going to be unwelcome and there's nowhere for them to go. The United States was the most desired destination for Jews, but America had quotas on how many Jews they would allow. By the time the Nazis rise to power, the number of Olim rises to over 250,000. And these weren't just young farmers who wanted to break out of the shtetls. These were people of all walks of life who wanted to survive. So we had not only people establishing kibbutzim, moshavs, there were people who were able to serve as doctors and lawyers and professionals. And this is also when we start to see a rise in Arab attacks on Jews. So I know it's hard to dialogue and things like this, but why do you think after all those years of Aliyah, it was at that time that there started to be attacks on Jews?
Is it because so many moving in and they felt the pressure of being outnumbered by the Jews that they would take over the land?
There was this sense, 20,000 Jews, 30,000 Jews in a place like Israel, imagine if the population of Louisiana went up 30,000, we wouldn't feel it all that much. If 300,000 people moved here all of a sudden, it would be a significant impact. So there was a sense of fear. There was also a sense of, I guess, not buyer's remorse, seller's remorse. So these areas like that desert that turned into Tel Aviv started to look like a nice functioning city. And those, barren lands around Jerusalem that were just hillsides started to become wineries and olive oil plants. And all of a sudden, all this land that was so worthless they would sell it to the Jews now becomes valuable. And when land becomes valuable, things start to become an issue. This leads us to 1948. And I'm going to pull up, I won't pull up a map quite yet. This leads us to 1948. And as the British and the European colonialism happened around the Middle East, the British had a mandate on what was the land of Palestine, and was set to expire in May of 1948. And at this moment, when it expired, Israel declared itself a sovereign nation. And hopefully the technology will work that I can play this.
ביום שישי, ה' באייר תש"ח, 14 במאי 1948, אחר הצהריים, באו המוזמנים אל בניין מוזיאון תל אביב בשדרות רוטשילד 16. הם התבקשו לשמור את סיבת ההזמנה, טקס הכרזת העצמאות, לסוד. אבל בבואם מצאו את חצי העיר ממתינה להם. סמוך לשעה 4 הגיע דוד בן גוריון. כל חייו היו מסע אל הרגע הזה.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי, להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית, אשר יפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי, ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה שוות זכויות בתוך העמים. לפיכך נתכנסנו אנו חברי מועצת העם, נציגי היישוב העברי והתנועה הציונית, ביום סיום המנדט הבריטי על ארץ ישראל. מתוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית, ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות, אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל. מתוך ביטחון בצור ישראל, הננו חותמים בחתימת ידינו לעדות על הכרזה זו.
So the Israeli Declaration of Independence gets me every time, no matter how many times I've seen it. When these people who have struggled their whole lives for freedom and represent a people that has struggled for 2,000 years for freedom establish a state, it still gives me goosebumps. And that place where that city center where they all were, Independence Hall, that's that barren desert from the picture at the beginning of Tel Aviv's existence. You can see how far they've come. Now, he mentioned, Ben-Gurion mentioned in his speech that in accordance to the will of the United Nations, and I'll share what he meant by that, the United Nations developed a partition plan. And the partition plan here we go. Hold on. Looked like this. The United Nations divided up the land of Israel in this very strange way. Orange is an Arab state. Blue is a Jewish state. And you can see the orange states don't connect here and the blue state doesn't connect here. Jerusalem is here in the middle. It's going to be like a Washington, D.C. It's going to be a non-part of any state, operated internationally. And any rational person would wonder, why would you possibly divide up a state like this? The answer is, as throughout the Aliyahs, when Jews were moving to Israel, they were buying land wherever they could. And a lot of that land was here in the Negev, which nobody wanted. Or it was here in the mountains where nobody really wanted. It wasn't here on the coast where it was a pretty populous area or surrounding Jerusalem. So the United Nations divided up the land based on where people were living. The goal was nobody should have to move. Jews would keep living in their blue areas. Arabs would keep living in their Arab areas. We don't know what that state would have been called. It could have been called Palestine. And Israel established their state based on that recommendation. Everybody agreed to this except for the Arab nations. And when the state of Israel declared its independence as a state, it was invaded by every neighboring country. And what happened here was both miraculous and shocking. The neighboring countries, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, invited the Arab residents of these orange cities, and even some of the blue cities, to evacuate. They said, get out, come behind the battle lines, and once we've destroyed the Jewish state, you can come back to your home and have whatever you want of what's left of the Jewish areas. Now, as we know, Israel won that war, miraculously won that war. And all of a sudden, Arabs had to face a choice. Were they going to come live in a Jewish state, which many refused, some did, or were they going to go back to where they evacuated to? One thing that made this decision easier, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, all refused to take in any refugees from this war. So after this war was fought, Israel goes from looking like this to this. And I'll go back and forth. You can see it again, here to here. Now, this was an embarrassing defeat for the Arab armies, but it was seen by them largely as temporary. So about 20 years later, in 1967, they began an attempt to reclaim the land that they lost and once again to destroy Israel. Egypt and Jordan began amassing their troops at the border, as did Syria and Lebanon. The plan was for Egypt to attack by the air, for Lebanon and Syria to come in up here, which up at the top, which is the Golan Heights, to come in from the north, and Transjordan to bring their forces, which are largely tanks, in from the west. Israel's intelligence detected this. They flew a low-level mission over to Egypt, and they destroyed almost the entire. Oh, can you guys see this pointer?
Yeah.
I just discovered that. So they flew this low-level mission here. They destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force, and they fought back Lebanon and Syria up here, and then they begged Jordan to stay out of it. Jordan, however, didn't stay out of it. They came in, they invaded, and then there's a blank screen. Hold on, I need to switch presentations. Let's see. I think this is it. Nope, that's not it. Hold on a second. Bear with me. Israel history. That's got to be it. Yep, here we go. All right, I'm going to get my little pointer again because that's fun. All right, so this was after 1948. Here's the battle lines after the invasion. And then after 1967, this became Israel. Israel captured the West Bank of Jordan, the Golan Heights up here, the Gaza Strip, and the entire Sinai Peninsula. And the Sinai Peninsula is significant. Number one, we've got the Suez Canal right here. But even more importantly, it is full of oil. Israel could have become very rich. Now, after this war was lost, the entire Arab League got together in Khartoum, Sudan, and they announced what became known as the three no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, and no recognition of Israel's right to exist. Now, Israel at this point had expanded their land to about triple the size. They've gained oil. They could have very easily just stayed put, continued to build, enrich themselves through this oil. But what they did next was negotiated peace with Egypt. Egypt was the first one to break this three no's resolution. And over time, the Sinai Peninsula was given back section by section. Not too long after that, they negotiated with Jordan. And Jordan not only was interested in peace because of security, but they were facing a crisis of water. So because of Jordan's crisis, they began a negotiation with Israel that not only centered on security, but with a water sharing agreement. So that was it. Since 1967, 2 states of the 23, I believe, Arab League, only 2 have acknowledged Israel's right to exist. Looking past how miraculous that these wars were, there was also the Yom Kippur War, which I didn't include in this presentation because there wasn't any land swap. But in the Yom Kippur War, they attacked on Yom Kippur when our army wasn't ready. And we still were able to push them back. So our ability to not only survive these wars, but to grow after them has been incredible. So this brings us to today. I said at the beginning that as miraculous as these wars were, what's happening now in Israel is potentially more miraculous. What's happening now in Israel is that Arab countries are starting to make peace with Israel with really nothing at stake. The Abraham Accord, which was agreed to in August, normalized relations between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. I'll talk about how this happened in a minute, but the significance of this really can't be overstated. Egypt had motivation to make peace with Israel. They could get their oil back, their land back. Jordan needed to make peace with Israel. They needed the water. They needed the security. But the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have no real goals here. They're not at war with Israel. They're not sharing land with Israel. They're not threatened by Israel in any way. So how did it get to this point where they were willing to make peace? It all goes back to the West Bank. And I'm going to pull up one more screen. Give me 1 second. I have to do this in my house because the internet is still down at the synagogue, and I have better internet here, even though it's not great. Okay, so what you're looking at now is the West Bank, not the West Bank, New Orleans, the West Bank in Israel, and you can see here everything in yellow. Ooh, let me get my little pointer thingy. Where did it go? Won't let me do it anymore. Everything in yellow is under Palestinian civil control. Everything in red are areas that Palestinians have built on that aren't technically under their control. Everything in light blue, purple is where Israel has military control. Everything in dark purple are Israeli settlements, and that medium purple, is that a word, is the boundary of the settlements. So you hear a lot about settlements from the anti-Israel crowd, that they're a barrier to peace, and it's not exactly true. The perception of the settlements is a barrier to peace. There are no Israeli settlements in Palestinian-controlled areas of the West Bank. All of the settlements that Israel is doing in the West Bank are in areas that are assumed to be ultimately under Israel's control whenever peace happens. So every time there's been a peace agreement, from the Clinton time to the Bush time to any time in history, these areas where Jews are building are areas that are included under Israeli sovereignty. So the settlements aren't really a problem, but they've always been a sticking point in the negotiations. So about 6 months ago, maybe longer, who has a concept of time anymore, Benjamin Netanyahu announced a plan to unilaterally annex the West Bank. And when this happened, people's ears perked up everywhere. There are people who are hardcore far-right Zionists who said, yes, finally we're taking all of the Palestinian land. There are people who are far-left Zionists who are saying, this is going to torpedo any sense of peace. There's me, who sits in the middle of that, who says, something's going on here that we don't know. And I talk to the people I know at AIPAC and involved in various parts of Israeli politics. And everybody saw this as part of a long game that Netanyahu was playing. Now I'm going to get political for a second. Any president in history of this country would have shut this down from the concept. If Netanyahu had told Obama, Bush, Clinton, Bush 1, Reagan, I'm going to annex the West Bank, America would have said, we're not going to support you. It's like throwing match on a gasoline pile. That's not a statement. But nobody wanted it done. Trump has kind of been what I would call, the kind of like a substitute teacher to Israel. We were talking about, doing classwork on Zoom. When a substitute comes in and puts in the big screen TV, the students can get away with whatever they want. And that's how Netanyahu has treated the Trump relationship. He knows that Trump will support him whatever he does. And, fortunately, that's been a good thing. Netanyahu said he's going to annex the West Bank, which nobody would bat an eye about because nobody in the Middle East believes he would actually do it. But then when America comes by and says, we support you, it changes. And at that moment, the United Arab Emirates came to Netanyahu and said, you can have the West Bank annexation or you can have peace. You can't have both. And Netanyahu said, peace. And the long game was realized. Netanyahu was never and is never going to annex the West Bank. But the fact that he was able to say he was going to do it with American support brought these Arab countries to the table. Now, what's happening now that the United Arab Emirates has broken the ice here is that they're all lining up behind them, because for decades, Israel has been the pariah in the Middle East. It's everybody against Israel. But right now, the title of the pariah in the Middle East goes to Iran. So you have battle lines being drawn. On one side, you have Iran, Turkey, Hamas, and Hezbollah. On the other side, you have Israel, which has always been on the other side. But now all of a sudden, it's Israel, Egypt, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and unofficially, although strategically, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, et cetera, et cetera. What we are witnessing is the beginning of what could possibly be peace in the Middle East. We all have been saying this all of our lives, and it could be happening right now. And what's amazing is it's not happening through war. It's happening through diplomacy. It's happening through realization that, and the Emirates have seen this already, the tourism that's happening between Israel and Dubai right now is incredible. Every rabbi I know who does annual Israel trips is now trying to add Dubai to the next trip. Their sharing of technology, and even in Israel, it's kind of a weird thing, but now all of a sudden washing machines are affordable in Israel because they can bring them in from Dubai. The ball is rolling and it is not stopping. Why is this, I think, as miraculous as these wars? Because we have sworn enemies becoming allies. And if Israel and the Arab League can stand on the same side, then any two people who disagree on anything can stand on the same side. We're seeing not only an unprecedented era of peace and security, but a model of how enemies don't have to be permanent and adversaries don't have to be permanent. That there's always common ground, there's always benefits that can be gained from, you know, we would say reaching across the aisle, they would say reaching across the desert. So, any questions, thoughts? I know I've been talking for a long time.
For me, you're clarifying a lot of stuff because it tends to be a little confusing. So
yeah, it's very confusing. It's very hard. You know, Jews right now are very politically, take it back. They're the same as they always were. Trump's Republican Party hasn't changed the dynamics of how Jews vote, at least as far as how exit polls are showing us. And, you know, there's a statement. And there's a statement that is true now, that has been true every single year since 1948. It will be true next year, regardless of who wins the presidency. The current US president has supported Israel in a way unlike anybody else in the past. That has been true every single year of the American-Israeli relations. And that's because the relationship has become more important as the years have gone on, both strategically, financially, and technologically. So at the beginning of December, AIPAC is coming to speak at our synagogue. We scheduled it for December because the topic is, you know, what the next administration looks like for Israel, and we didn't think we would know in November what the administration, who that would be. But for Zionists like me, you always wonder, is the Israel-American relationship going to improve? And as long as the military and financial ties grow, the relationship will continue to grow. So even if the presidency switches to Biden, all of these agreements, the Abraham Accords that are in motion, they can't be stopped. The only way that they stop is if, and this would be a wonderful thing, if all of a sudden Iran becomes a peaceful nation with no nuclear ambitions, that doesn't fund terror across the middle. If that stops, then it changes. But I can't imagine Iran ever giving up its nuclear ambitions, ever coming to the side of peace. And you know, they're the main funder of terrorism in the Middle East. As long as they are over here, they are a threat to every other nation in the Middle East. And who's the strongest nation in the Middle East right now? It's Israel. So it's amazing. We're now selling fighter planes to countries that a year ago swore to our destruction. We now have travel bureaus in countries that wouldn't even recognize Israel's right to exist. So, you know, my hope is that in the next 6 months, the political scene becomes calmer and the coronavirus starts to disappear, God willing, and all of that can be pushed to the side to see just how miraculous of a time we are living in when it comes to the state of Israel. That's my hope. My hope is that, you know, I think one of the reasons you're not hearing a lot about it is because it's really good for Israel, and the media tends to like to report things that are bad for Israel. But God willing, you'll see it soon. And if not, if you come to services, you'll hear it from me.
So how do you perceive the life of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip improving? Do you think that relationships improve, then they'll start to get resources and be more trusted so Israel can take down some of the barriers? Good question.
The barriers, I can't imagine the barriers coming down. The reason is, from the minute the barriers went up, there has not been a single suicide bomber. And before those barriers went up, this is part of the reason Netanyahu has such broad support in Israel, even though his policies, especially in regards to him favoring the Orthodox, are hugely unpopular. But the truth is, before Netanyahu was in office, whenever you left the house, you had to kiss your mother and say goodbye because it might be the last time you saw her. They had calculations, when if somebody had a date and wanted to go out that evening, if greater than 6 people were killed by terrorists today, they wouldn't go out, but if it were fewer, they would. This crazy world where, when I lived in Israel in 2006, you can't go into a restaurant without, it's like going through the airport. You can't go into a restaurant without them checking your purse or scanning you with a metal detector. And now you can. So the security now, when I was there last year with our congregation, I couldn't believe how much more comfortable it felt. And that's because of those barriers. This conversation is not about the Palestinians at the moment. That's a whole separate hour-long class. But it is my belief that the Palestinians as a people are largely peaceful and want that peace with Israel, just like these other Arab states. They are, in a way, being held captive by their leadership. They elected Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 2006, and they haven't held an election since then. They're not allowed to dissent in media. In fact, there's currently a Palestinian activist who had a Zoom call with an Israeli peace activist and has been detained now for 6 months. No word as to whether he's still alive or anything. So I believe, and I know this is a big statement that I'm happy to clarify at another time, I don't think there's a country that cares more about the Palestinian well-being than the state of Israel, period. They're the only ones that send aid into Palestinian territories without condition. They're the only ones who, quite frankly, when Hamas fires rockets at Israel, they do so from elementary schools. When Israel targets a rocket launching site in the Palestinian territories, they actually call the residents and they warn people to get out. They drop leaflets. They do what's called a door knock, where they drop it's almost like a firework that makes a noise in case they can't reach people on the phone. They go through unprecedented lengths for the security of Palestinian civilians, whereas more Palestinian civilians are killed by misfired rockets than anything Israel does. So the Palestinians won't have prosperity until they have leadership that cares as much about them as they do themselves. Being a refugee state is very profitable. They get billions of dollars in aid every year with no accountability. There's no reason for that area to be as poor as it is. Again, that's a much bigger topic with big, broad statements. But yes, anything that makes the general Middle East more peaceful, anything that weakens Iran, will ultimately benefit the Palestinians. Also, the peace agreements, whether it be Trump's latest effort or Clinton's last effort, they all have been rejected at the last minute because Israel is offering 97% of the West Bank, not 100% of the West Bank. And they've been able to do that because every Arab state around them has agreed not to normalize with Israel until the West Bank issue is settled. But now all of a sudden it's off the table. Now peace is being made, and that card can no longer be played by Palestinian leadership. So, if they wanted, they could have 97% of the West Bank, 100% of the Gaza Strip, and be a sovereign nation tomorrow. But they've been holding on to that last 3%. They've been holding on to all of Jerusalem, and it's just not going to happen. So yes, my hope is that all of this leads to a better life for everybody in the Middle East, especially the Palestinians.
Anyone else?
Any other questions?
But silent people today.
Well, I hope at the very least this took your mind off the television screen and the virus. So there's this great, the blessing for the study of Torah is la'asok b'divrei Torah, to occupy ourselves with words of Torah. It's made just for these moments when you don't want to stare at any screens and you don't want to hear about the world outside. Study some Torah. It'll be good for you.
Well, I know I appreciated it.
Well, anytime. I'm always happy and excited to join you guys. And I truly hope that next time we're in person.
I agree. Thank
All right,
you
well,
so much for joining us. Rabbi Gerber is always the first person to reply when I send out my request, and I am so grateful. We love having you, and the talks are always so interesting.
Thank you. And if you guys have any requests for the next one, just let me know. I'm happy to teach whatever y'all want to learn. If I don't know it, I'll learn it.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Be well, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Rachel?